Greetings all, Ferrari 601 here. Welcome back to another 1/18th scale model car review of this, brought to us by Auto Art, the Red Bull X2014. What is this? Well, this is the only car in my collection that does not have a real-world analog. There is no one-to-one running version of the Red Bull X2014. What is, then, the Red Bull X2014, and why do I even have it in the collection? Well, the story of this car actually goes back to around 2009, 2010, and the launch of the Gran Turismo 5 video game, a PlayStation exclusive. Then it was a PlayStation 3 exclusive. The Gran Turismo series, it is a series of racing simulator video games that go back all the way to the mid to late 90s with the initial release of Gran Turismo on PlayStation 1, Polyphony Digital being the company that developed and published this video game series. And it was a colossal favorite of mine. You can even make an argument that Gran Turismo was the thing that got me absolutely hooked on motorsport. It was my introduction to sim racing, and I still credit Gran Turismo with me beginning to hone my understanding of how cars worked, vehicle dynamics, and ultimately my exposure to the Gran Turismo series is what created Ferrari 601. So I have a lot to thank Polyphony Digital for and the Gran Turismo series for in terms of introducing me to sim racing and motorsport in general, but enough of that. When it was time to transport the Gran Turismo series from PlayStation 2 to PlayStation 3, Polyphony Digital wanted to do something a little bit special. Gran Turismo 4 was a tremendous, tremendous game. It came out in 2004, I believe. It had, 1,000 cars, something like that, and it was absolutely great, and it still plays well today. Gran Turismo 5 was going to be the series' first installment on PlayStation 3, a revolutionary new console with tremendous graphics capability, and it was mind-blowing when it came out. To make Gran Turismo 5 even more mind-blowing, though, Polyphony Digital had an idea. What if we could create a race car without any consideration to rules, regulations, or even personal safety for drivers and spectators? We're going to create this thing in a virtual world. We're going to operate it in a virtual world, and we just want to see what's remotely possible just by applying some reasonably good laws of physics as you would get in the Gran Turismo series. Who better to design a concept like this than Adrian Newey? Yes, that same Adrian Newey who we talked about quite extensively in our recent reviews of the Red Bull RB6, 7, and 8 Formula One cars. Yes, that same Adrian Newey was employed by Polyphony Digital to sketch a design for an ultimate fantasy race car. No rules, no regulations, no concern for common sense, health, or safety. What could you build if you had an absolute clean slate? Adrian Newey came up with the Red Bull X2010, initially called the Red Bull X1, which was quite similar to this, the X2014 that we see before us. This car is a fan car. It uses a big underbody fan to create a lot of downforce, and thereby a lot of grip, and thereby a lot of cornering force, and thereby a lot of lap time lost because you've gained it all in performance. It has over 1,000 horsepower. It weighs less than 590 kilos, and it is, in theory, the fastest thing that could be built on four wheels. And it was an exclusive to the Gran Turismo series. Sebastian Vettel got involved in the project, and he even drove the car in a demo that later became content in the final Gran Turismo 5 video game. It is an absolutely wild thing. And for later installments of the Gran Turismo series, Gran Turismo 6 in particular, the X2010 got an update, and that is what you see before us, the X2014. Effectively the same car under the skin as the X2010, but some aerodynamic tweaks topside, a little bit of a longer wheelbase, I'm led to believe, and a slightly improved underbody fan system for creating even more peak downforce at no speed at all. So that is what this car actually is. Auto Art teamed up with Polyphony Digital and Red Bull Technologies to create this 1/18th scale rendition of the digital product that is the Red Bull X2014. And that is what you see before you right now. let's hunker down and take a look at what we see here on not quite this 1/18th scale model, rather this 18 times smaller than real life prototype of something that has never been built.
The Red Bull X2014. What is this? Well, as I said, it is the only car in my collection that is 100% fantasy in that it does not have a real-world analog, past, present, and probably not future either. A car like this has never actually been built, which means that in terms of things like technical specifications, competition history, we really don't have much to go on because there is no real-world analog for this. In other words, this means that we can't even really call this a scale model per se. Yes, this is a scale model in the sense that it's in 1/18th scale. It's designed to represent something that would be 18 times larger than this. However, that something in 1/1 doesn't exist. So what we have before us is not so much a showpiece in the sense of being a scale model, but rather it's a design study. It's a prototype. It's an engineering statement, if you will, because there is no real-world analog, which makes this, despite being one of the strangest things in my collection, also makes it one of the most interesting, because I have just as good a claim as anybody else who has one of these to say I actually physically own a Red Bull X2014, in the sense of I can touch it. Anyone who has this on the Gran Turismo video games, well, you can drive it, I suppose, but it's stuck in your computer. It's stuck in your console, whatever Gran Turismo is played on these days. I've got this one, and anybody else who has this has got it too, which is interesting, because it's not often that we get a physical representation of something from a video game either. So it's interesting in the sense of, okay, it's a representation, it's a design study of a fantasy vehicle that probably will never be built. And it's also interesting in the sense of, you can go boot up a video game and you can play with this. And you can say that that experience of playing with this car on a game is the experience of driving it, because that's as close as anybody is ever going to get, because it doesn't exist. It's just an interesting thought experiment for me, and I get a kick out of it. And that's really the reason why I have this car, because obviously I can't then sit there, look at it, and think about its competition history and remember the days of being a fan of the series that it raced in, because none of that ever happened. But what do we actually have here? And because we have this as a physical object, what can we divine about the one-to-one actual running version that this would represent, should that ever be built? Well, we do have some information based on how the car appears in the Gran Turismo video game series, and we can sort of glean some details from that. We can also glean some details based off of our knowledge of open-wheel racing cars, particularly ones of much more recent years. This is meant to represent a 2014 design, and those of you who know 2014 era Formula 1, for example, will very quickly see that this car bears essentially zero resemblance, except for maybe the front suspension, to anything that we've ever seen before in Formula 1. So, very loosely related to a Formula 1 car, I would say, but fundamentally different in basically every aspect. What we have before us here, it is, in principle, an open-wheeled racing car. You will notice that we do not really have open wheels on this thing, because on the front end we have got these fairings that cover the front wheels entirely. They even integrate headlights into them. And then on the rear axle, we can't even really see definitively where the wheels actually are. We've got these big haunches that cover up the rear axle entirely. We have no suggestion as to where the tires are, unlike on the front axle, where you can just sort of see the bottom surface of the tire there as you get down to the ground. On the rear, they are almost entirely enclosed in these fairings and skirts that go almost down to the road surface, and they seal that under tray, which is very important on this car. We'll get into that later on. But it's an open-wheel racing car. We also are following generally the same overall architectural idea that has defined open-wheel racing cars since the pre-war Grand Prix days, in particular cars from Auto Union, where you had a front axle and then a cockpit behind the front axle. Behind the cockpit is a fuel tank. Behind the fuel tank is an engine and driveline going to the rear axle. So we've got a mid-engined rear-wheel drive open-wheel race car here. That's all well familiar. Other things that are familiar here. We've got a V6 engine in this car. Formula One cars in 2014 also had V6s. This one is turbocharged, I believe it is, and Formula One engines are turbocharged as well, as they were in 2014. Maximum power specifications that we have here on this car, well, it's a little bit difficult, really, because in the Gran Turismo series, power is, well, they give a horsepower measurement, but they also give performance points, which are an aggregate measure of power and overall cornering performance, but we're not going to really concern ourselves with that. Power that we've got, according to Gran Turismo, 1,251 horsepower at the crankshaft. So this would be just about as powerful as the most powerful Formula One engines ever. In particular, I'm talking about the 1986 turbo qualifying engines, where we were getting in excess of 1,100 horsepower for a couple of laps before they detonated themselves. We could probably expect similar reliability figures from this car should it be built. That engine is displacing 3 liters, so a bit bigger, almost twice the size of a modern Formula One engine, where we have 1.6 liters. So it is just a hair under twice the size of a modern Formula One engine in displacement. But 1,251 horsepower, that's an awful lot of power generation from that 6-cylinder engine. Pretty cool. Overall weight on this thing, purported at 505 kilograms, or right on 1,200 pounds for those of you measuring in America money. So very light, far lighter than a modern Formula One car, and depending on whose figures you want to believe, about 15 to 20% more powerful. It's pretty interesting. Lots of performance potential. Obviously, it's going to be really fast in a straight line with all of this streamlined bodywork. Obviously, it's going to be probably just about as safe from a driving perspective as a modern Formula One car, because we do have an entirely enclosed cockpit. We've got a roll structure behind the cockpit in a more or less traditional place, so really you can see some of the overall design resemblance there between Formula One and this. Other things, though, that we can divine that are a little bit harder to get from the Gran Turismo series directly. Some specifications in terms of dimensions on this car. Well, because this is a physical object that we have in front of us, we can measure it, and I have measured it. And therefore, from the measurements that I can glean from this model, we can deduce, we can postulate by multiplying these things by a factor of 18 what the real-world measurements of the real car would be. This model is 279.4 millimeters long. It is 127 millimeters wide. It has a wheelbase of 152.4 millimeters. And the front and rear tracks are identical, both at 101.6 millimeters. If we extrapolate this up for a 1-to-1 size, assuming that this is 18 times smaller than a 1-to-1 version, that gives us overall dimensions of 5,029.2 millimeters, so just a hair over 5 meters long, 2,286 millimeters wide, so 2.28 meters wide. The wheelbase is 2,743.2 millimeters, so 2.7.5 meter wheelbase, and front and rear tracks at 1,828 millimeters. So 1.8 meters wide in terms of the front track, 2.2 meters wide overall, and then our wheelbase is just a hair over 5 meters. So we are about the same length of a Formula One car in 2022. We are slightly wider than a 2022 Formula One car. But dimensionally very similar to the Formula One cars that we are seeing in the current year, which is quite interesting. However, it doesn't actually exist. And my measurements could have a margin of error, I'm sure they do. I wasn't very precise with them, so your mileage may vary with that. But I just find it interesting that we're able to take a look at this and we can extrapolate what a 1-to-1 would be like. And I know that mock-ups of this have been built more or less on a 1-to-1 scale before for PR events and things. But again, I don't own one of those. I own this. So it's just interesting to be able to look at this and know that it's a fantastical idea, but just project your mind's eye into what could be if it were, you know. It's interesting. Stopping the rotation here, let's just take a look at what we have going on here with this car. What's readily apparent that will enable us to start deducing the overall design philosophy here. Starting at the front end, what do we have? Do we have a front wing? Yeah, we got a front wing. We have a nose cone, which is quite obvious. We have got these really long pylons, which are attaching to a front wing assembly. There is not so much of an angle of attack to this wing, at least not in the main plane, but we do have a front wing mounted on pylons to a nose cone structure. Okay, so that's pretty familiar, and that's something that is not all that foreign to us whatsoever. In fact, you can even see some of the mounting hardware attaching that front wing to the pylons. So that's pretty normal. Okay, so clearly we're trying to condition some air heading in through the front end of the car and create some downforce with it via some upturn sections on the trailing side of this front wing. We can't quite see from this angle, but we do have a fairly substantial upward rake of this front wing toward its trailing profile. So interesting. However, what we also have are these huge fairings along the front sides of the car here, completely enclosing the front wheels. You can see a hint of, in this case, the right front tire underneath here on this fairing, and you can see it's a slick tire and it's contacting the road surface. However, you can't really see the wheel itself. It's behind this fairing, which is movable with the front axle as it steers, so the wheel is entirely enclosed all the time as the car is traveling, and it's even enclosed directionally as steering input is going through. So clearly we are going for drag reduction here. Obviously, we also have headlights on this car, very different from a Formula One car, which of course don't even have a space where you could put a headlight. But here we have got headlights inside these front fenders, I suppose you could call them, and we even have a little dive plane right in here. This is a nod from basically any other form of racing car that is not open-wheeled. We've got dive planes along the front end someplace or other, and we've got one here on X2014. It's interesting. On the inboard sides of these fairings, here on the right front, you can see that we have got a duct that is feeding into a brake cooling duct. Obviously, these really only line up when the car is going straight ahead, but we've got brake cooling going on in a very conventional way, as we would see on not just a modern open-wheeled car, but also on prototypes. You would see things like this, and even on tin tops like GT cars and even DTM, you would see brake ducts like this. So that's not at all foreign either. What is foreign, though, is the way that these fairings are integrated into the front wing. You can see that the front wing has a very high end fence structure that bolts directly into these fairings or fenders, whatever we want to call them, and that is part of what secures the fairing to the car itself. So the front wing end fence is integrating into the fairing, is integrating into the rest of the front end bodywork on this car. It's real interesting to see, and obviously a huge departure from what we have on modern open-wheeled cars in the real world. What we also have on this car in the front end, as we continue to move up, we've got ourselves a canopy. We have an entirely closed, enclosed cockpit on this car. There's no halo. Halo really wasn't even a thing here in 2014 when this car is purported to have been designed. However, we were, even in this time, thinking about enclosing the cockpit. We were thinking about it on safety grounds, but we were also thinking about it just in terms of aerodynamic efficiency. Having an open cockpit just exposes a whole lot more possibility for turbulence and dirty air and drag, and that's just something that saps performance away from these cars. So if you could enclose the cockpit, you would enclose the cockpit, and you'll notice that all prototypes today, all Le Mans prototypes, for example, they all have closed cockpits, partially for safety, partially for aerodynamic efficiency. It just conspires to make an all-around better car, even though open cockpits are real cool, and I wish we would see more of them in the modern era. But we have an enclosed cockpit here. It has a canopy, and obviously that canopy is going to be made of very high-grade ballistics-grade materials. It's going to be quite literally bulletproof to stop small stone debris and other pieces of cars out there. It's also going to be pretty resilient in roll situations. It'll probably take the weight of the car should the car roll over and put a lot of weight on the canopy. However, it does raise the question of driver extrication in a rollover, much like Halo has raised that question in the real world. But that's the idea here. completely encloses the cockpit. Obviously, the driver still needs to wear a helmet and other associated safety gear, but he's not going to have the wind blast in his face, so maybe he doesn't have to have his visor lowered all the time. But we do have a canopy, quite obviously. On top of the car, the highest point here, we don't have a snorkel. This is a twin-turbo engine, I'm led to believe, and therefore we don't have an intake snorkel. Now, other cars that have had twin-turbo engines have fed them through snorkels like we have on modern Formula One cars, let's say, but they're not strictly necessary. Remember, we had the single-turbo V8 engines in the kart series in the United States in the mid-late 90s through the early 2000s. That was a single-turbo engine. They were fed through ducts in the sides of the bodywork. But they did have a roll hoop up here, just like we have here. IndyCar today, they feed their twin-turbo intakes through ducts in the sides of the bodywork, but prior to the IR18 days, they were feeding them through a snorkel. So you don't have to eliminate the snorkel when you get a twin-turbo solution, but you can, and in this case, Red Bull and Adrian Newey choosing to do that and just replacing it with a roll hoop, which superficially looks like an intake snorkel, but it is not. It is just open and pass through, and you'll see that when we look at the car from front and rear on. However, we also see along the engine cover, we've got a shark fin. Remember our review of the Red Bull RB6, a very real-world Formula One car. We had a big shark fin on that car. This one, we have an almost identical sort of structure. Obviously, it looks physically different in terms of its overall dimensions, but it's doing the same thing. It's trying to clean up and smooth out airflow laterally across the mid and rear section of the car as we're going around high-speed corners, just to have a little bit more consistent pressure laterally on the car so that we don't unsettle the rear end with crosswinds and things like that. So just a little bit more confidence for the driver. But it is extending from basically the snorkel, the roll hoop area here on this car, and it's attaching itself to the rear wing. Now, there's no F duct or anything like that on this car. However, same idea with that shark fin, and it looks pretty cool. We do have a rear wing here. It's very wide and very low. It does not really stick up. It's actually not the highest point on the car, unlike, say, the Red Bull RB6, for example, or even a modern Formula One car in 2022. But it's very large, and it's very wide, and we've got multiple elements on it, which you can kind of see here, but we'll get a better look at that later on. If we move down, though, now we start to see what's going on midline and low side on the car. There's our front end. As we go down toward the midsection, you can see that we have got two major areas that air is going to be going. First of all, we've got an intake here. It's mostly hidden by this front wheel fairing, but air intake for radiators as well as engine air intake for combustion. So you'll see that later on. But you can see that we have got these two big areas for airflow. We have got this area under the car, so there's the ground, and this is the floor. We can call this a reference plane if you want, just to be consistent in our use of Formula One terminology, but it is not a reference plane, it's just the diffuser, it's the floor of the car. And then inside here, this is a big hollow cavity. Right in here we have got a colossal amount of air going through, and this is going to be very important for how this car actually works, because we haven't really talked about aerodynamics yet. We talked about the front end, what they're doing here. We've got a little bit of a front wing, and we've got a rear wing, which is more or less conventional looking if we're talking about Le Mans prototypes, for example. But we're not really using those wings for downforce in as much as it's how we're going to be generating most of our aerodynamic grip. This under tray, though, oh yeah, we have a lot of stuff going on in here. And it's not just the fact that we are ramming colossal amounts of atmosphere through these huge tunnels here on either side. We're doing a bit more than that, and we're doing it actively. But we will save that for a little bit later on, but generally speaking, we've got a lot of stuff going on here. Overall, though, it's a very clean car. It's designed to generate the least amount of drag possible. That's what these fairings are for. That's what the shark fin is for. That's what keeping the rear wing as low as possible is for. It's what shrouding the wheels is for. Low drag is the name of the game. High top speeds in a straight line, definitely conceivable with this car. I think in the Gran Turismo game it's capable of exceeding 250 miles per hour, so that's over 400 kilometers per hour. It's really quick in a straight line, but it's also obscenely quick in the corners, and we'll start to talk about why this is next. Looking straight on here from the front end of X2014, what do we see? Well, we do see that high nose. So again, this is reminiscent of Formula One design prior to, when did we really start with the step noses? 2012, we started with the step noses, and then 2014, we got into the proboscis noses. Yes, that's what I'm going to call them, where the nose tip had to be really low, but the rest of the nose structure could be higher, and some teams decided to do it with a step, some teams decided to do it with this long protrusion curving down toward the deck, and it was hideous. Not the case here, though. Adrian Newey deciding, yes, we want to keep this nose as high and as flat as possible because we want air going through the underfloor of this car, and we just need space for that to happen. So that's what we're doing on X2014, a high and flat nose, our front wing mounted on pylons, and that front wing itself being relatively flat. You can just see here the trailing surface of that front wing is flared up a bit, but not colossally. We are generating some topside downforce with it, but not an awful lot, and not until we get up to some really high speed. So again, we're going for low drag rather than high downforce with our top side on this car. However, we can also see here on the front end, we have almost an entirely conventional suspension for an open-wheeled car these days. We have wishbone, wishbone, push rod, double wishbone, push rod, front suspension on this car. This is something that is well familiar to all of you. So that is a breath of fresh air. Amid all of this futuristic strangeness, there's something that's awfully familiar. Additionally, though, we can also see here on these fairings, integrating these headlights. The headlights look really nice, I must say, as well as these little dive planes. They're not quite vortex generators. They're not like you would see on the extreme outboard sides of the end fences on a Formula One wing from basically 2021 all the way back to 1995 or so. But they're dive planes, so they're just trying to add a little bit more front downforce right on the front axle directly. So that's what those are for, and they look fairly conventional relative to other dive planes that we have seen. Additionally, though, we have got this void right underneath the headlight. What's that for? Well, this is part of our intake for brake cooling. And you can see we have this duct that comes out the side, and it feeds into a duct in the wheel fairing itself. So if we can actually steer these front wheels a little bit, and you can see that as we do steer these front wheels, the alignment kind of goes off between the backside of this duct on the fairing and the duct on the wheel itself. So then when they're straight ahead, you can see that they line up and you get the brake cooling that way. But it's feeding through this little intake duct right here. So that's kind of cool, and obviously it's happening on both sides. Other things that we can see, taking a look down the center line of the car, underneath the nose, you can see the lower wishbones mounting directly into the chassis, so we do not have a keel on this car. It's a zero keel design. Neither do we have the tongue or T-tray in this car. So a little bit of a departure from contemporary Formula One design where we have this flat quadrilateral section. It's mostly squared off area underneath the front of the monocoque, which is the T-tray and is the front edge of the diffuser, really. It's the front edge of the floor. We don't have that on this car because we're not bound to any regulations. So we don't have it. What we have in its place is just this very stout and sharp leading edge of the chassis. So what you're looking at here, this gray area that comes to a point, that is the front of the chassis. So that's the tub, that's the monocoque, and that is where the cockpit is, quite obviously. Driver sits fairly far rears on this car. It's actually quite reminiscent of a modern Formula One car in terms of how long they've become, but this doesn't look as bulky as those do because of the rest of the geometry of the front end. There's nothing in between the outboard side of the car and the side of the cockpit, really. So there's no side pod, there are no impact structures. It's just open. So it works that way in terms of the aesthetic proportion, but you're seeing the front of the chassis right in through this section. So that's rather interesting. Moving outboard a little bit, you do not see barge boards or anything. It's all just very clean coming through these sections as we move rearward. It's just all clean. The sides of the chassis itself are what are directing the air toward our radiator inlets up top here on either side, as well as these little devices here. These are structural. These are actually bracing those wheel fairings along the front end. However, they are also serving an aerodynamic purpose to help bifurcate this flow that's heading in toward the radiator intakes and the engine air intakes actually in this section. So we're bifurcating that flow. Some will pass into the radiators and some will pass down into this huge void just beyond and behind where we're going to start feeding the diffuser. But again, the diffuser is a completely different matter on this car because it's entirely unconventional in how that works. But across the front end, quite alien, but some things that are rather familiar, particularly that front suspension arrangement. On the right side of X2014, what can we divine? Well, obviously we have got ourselves our wheel fairing here. That's all well and good, and you can just see those dive planes along the front, as well as those wheel fairings that are covering the wheels themselves, the steerable portion of this fairing. That's cool, and you can see the sidewall of that front tire. Along the trailing edges of these wheel fairings, you can see these carbon panels. These are aerodynamic. As the car is going to be generating downforce, these will squat down, and at times they may well scrape the road surface. So I would perfectly expect there to be a sacrificial magnesium or titanium skid block underneath here. These would probably throw up crazy sparks and would be looking really, really cool. But this is non-structural to the, I would say non-structural to the fairing, but very important aerodynamically because these will be skirts that will effectively seal the front end of the car as they come down, as the download increases. So that's going to be real cool. Additionally, along the side here is our absolutely enormous intake for the engine, as well as radiators. So pulling double duty here with these intakes, but engine intake air for the combustion, as well as cooling air for the radiators. Additionally, you can see we have got this flying buttress structure, I suppose you can say, directing air partially into the intakes along the sides and partially down where we have, as close as we can say, to a side pod here, this very aggressively undercut section of bodywork. I mean, the extreme edge of the car outboard is here, and inside underneath here, there is the side pod structure where the radiators are actually mounted. Which means that everything from this point to this point is difficult to see in 2 dimensions for you, but from this point to this point is all empty space, so much free and empty space to play with, wherein all this air that's gone through the front of the car just gets shot into the diffuser. So lots and lots and lots and lots of air going into here for colossal downforce gains. Additionally, on our trailing side here, more wheel fairings entirely enclosing these rear wheels here. Obviously, we still have our cavity for intake air into the diffuser. Some of that's going to be routed in toward rear brake cooling. Our rear axle is in this area, the rear wheel, just behind this little removable panel here, emblazoned with the Gran Turismo logo. And you could even see the little clips that would be undone, I presume, if you wanted to be removing that. So that's cool. Additionally, very similar to the front fairings, you can see these carbon areas on the rear fairings. Some of these may well come down and scrape the road, depending on what's going on dynamically with the downforce generation. And then here, you can see it's not an end fence, really. It is just the edge of the rear wing. So real cool to see. You can see the rear wing being supported from above with these swan neck columns, could you call them? Struts, strakes, not entirely sure what you would call these things, but it's a swan neck arrangement sort of, and you can see just generally how that would work. So that's real interesting. Obviously there's a lot of focus on this car. We mentioned low drag, but there's so much focus on this center zone and this rear zone. Why? What's going on? We know that the diffuser, and particularly the rear 35-40% of the diffuser on a modern Formula One car, particularly nowadays in 2022, where they're making that ground effect downforce, is so important for performance. This car is focusing very heavily on that area as well. Why though? What's this car's party trick? As if all of this crazy design wasn't enough of a party trick. Well, what's going to happen next will absolutely blow the world apart. Well, do you see it? If you don't see it, then perhaps this is your first day looking at race cars, real or not. But yeah, this rear zone, this is quite interesting. First of all, here's our rear wing. It's our first proper look at it. Double element rear wing. We've got a main plane and then an upper flap. Huge slot gap between them, so lots of high speed, high pressure air going through here. So we're going to be making downforce with this. However, the angle of attack is extremely low, so we're not going to be making a lot of downforce until we get up to basically maximum speed. However, what we really have got going on here, what, pray tell, is this massive device? No, it's not a jet engine, although it has something in common with a jet engine in terms of we're sucking in a lot of air through this aperture. What is it? It's a fan. Yeah, it's a gigantic centerline powered fan that is running this car's downforce generation. This is an active blown diffuser fan car. Yeah, in the same way that the Brabham BT46B was an active blown diffuser fan car back in 1978? Something like that? Yes, please don't crucify me for getting that wrong. It's only the most iconic thing in Formula One history. Anyway, though, just as Gordon Murray and Brabham in the mid-70s said, you know what, we can make an awful lot of downforce if we have a giant fan out the back and we intake that air through the under tray of the car. That's exactly what Adrian Newey wants to do here on X2014. This fan is going to run at incredibly high speed, and I'm not entirely sure how it's actually run. I don't know if it's run directly off of the engine, or if it's run through the gearbox, or if it has its own drive system, sort of like the Chaparral 2J, where it actually had I believe it was a two-cylinder snowmobile engine that ran fans that sucked all of the air out from underneath that car and gave it crazy downforce. But regardless, this enormous fan is going to be sucking in a colossal amount of air through the under tray, and it's going to be bolstered by all the flow coming through the center line of the car through those huge voids that we took a look at from the front earlier on. This means that this car is going to be generating maximum downforce at 0 speed. So this car's downforce generation is entirely independent of its airspeed. In other words, you turn the car on and you turn the fan on, and the car's going to hunker down like a reverse hovercraft as soon as that fan comes up to speed. This means that you can get maximum traction from a standing start. You can make absolutely crazy high apex speed around a lot of corners, and not just high speed corners either, because you can play with downforce at low speed corners. So the Monaco hairpin, the station hairpin, or whatever they call it now, that hairpin could be taken at easily twice the apex speed that it currently is by a Formula One car in something like this, provided that it's narrow enough to make it through. I mean, we got a fairly wide car here, but your whole idea of how to approach a corner and how fast can the car actually go and still stick, that's getting thrown out the window here, because we've got an enormous amount of aerodynamic grip available all the time because of that fan. The whole rationale of having an active blown diffuser through a fan here, you do not want the car to be dependent on its air speed for downforce generation. This means that you can make this downforce incredibly consistent, and you can control exactly how much of it you have as a function of fan speed. So while you are going at maximum speed down a straight, you might want to turn the fan off so that you can get a little bit less drag by having the car, rather than having it hunker down and suck down to the tarmac and physically drag along the ground. You can turn the fan off and have the ride height come up a little bit. Williams did this quite famously in 1992 with the FW14B. Down the straights, they'd raise up that active suspension, and the car would stop dragging along the track surface and generate less drag and go faster in a straight line. Something like that could happen on a car like this. You will want to have that fan running at full speed through the corners, though, because now all of a sudden, I mean, we think of corners like Copse at Silverstone, where the Formula One cars are taking it basically flat in 7th or 8th gear, and we think that's absolutely amazing, and it is absolutely amazing. Well, this car might be able to take something like, what's the slowest speed corner at Silverstone? Is it that farm thing? Yes, the thing before Aintree is it's the thing. It's turn 3 at Silverstone. This car might be able to take turn 3 at Silverstone at well more than twice the speed that it currently is, while accelerating hard. So that's really what you want with the fan underbody here. Maximum downforce all the time. It does not care about your airspeed. It does not care about dirty air. It does not care about the wing settings. So it's amazing. Additionally, though, you can see some more details here. You see these apertures here and here. Those are your engine exhausts. Remember RB6 with the side exhaust? Yep, it's here too on X2014. Interesting. Quite interesting indeed. In addition, though, what do we have? We have got our trailing surface of the rear wing. We also have the trailing surfaces of our wheel fairings here. Taillights. So, yep, taillights, brake lights, all of that. We've got our diffuser. Notice on the underside of our diffuser here, unlike on a Formula 1 diffuser, no strakes. It's just an upturn in the bodywork, and it just terminates. No strakes coming from the bottom of the floor to the ground, and no strakes in here either. All of that sculpting of the airflow is just completely unnecessary now that we have got this big old fan down the center, just evacuating all of that air underneath the car. It's intense. It is quite intense. Cornering forces, I think, in the Gran Turismo game, cornering forces in excess of 7G are possible in this car. And probably the ultimate G loading that would theoretically be possible is in excess of 9G. And now we're talking about things that even some of the most elite fighter pilots of the world cannot sustain for a very long time. Racing drivers, yeah, they're very fit individuals, but the maximum G loading that they might ever really experience while driving under normal conditions might be 6G for a very short time. Maybe a little bit higher under peak braking in extreme circumstances, but we're not going to be talking about hitting over 8G through multiple corners on every lap. And now we start to get into the realm of, would a car like this even be drivable at speed by a typical human being, race driver or not? Because you're going to start to take some serious damage from experiencing forces like that for too long over too many repeated durations. So it's really starting to knock on the door of impossibility in terms of building this car in reality. But in the game, that's what this thing can do, and this is why it can do it. We have got an active fan blowing the diffuser, evacuating all the air from underneath the car, and creating more downforce than anything that's ever been created before. And here, for the sake of continuity, what's going on along the left flank of X2014. Same details that we've already seen on the right side, just repeated here. Obviously, wheel fairings here on the left side. And then as we start to move rears, you can see just what's going on with our bodywork and therefore the airflow through the car. It's pretty wild. It's absolutely wild. But what I do find very interesting here is that unless you're looking at the car from pretty much directly rear on, you have absolutely no idea of the trickery that's going on at the back with the fan. It's all hidden unless you're looking directly at it. I love the surreptitiousness of all of that. It's a great idea. You could have had big intakes topside for the fan if you wanted, but no, they decided not to do that. We're going to intake all of it from underneath. And we're going to blow this diffuser and we're going to evacuate all of this air in a somewhat discreet manner. But we're going to do it to great effect, and you're only going to see it when the car's already in front of you. So by that point, it's too late to mount a counterattack. I like all of that immensely, and this shows up quite well. I do very much appreciate the design work that's gone on with this thing. It's really, really nice. Really, really nice indeed. Going freehand here on X2014. First of all, here's the front end and that front wing structure that we were talking about earlier. You can see the overall profile of this. We do, believe it or not, have this roughly delta profile that we started to see on Formula One front wings beginning in 2017. So remember, this is a 2014 design, and this is something that actually made it into the real world only a few years later. So right here, this is some carryover from fantasy into the real world. So that's cool. That's one element of this car that I suppose has made it into the real world. Nothing else really has, but that's interesting to note. And I just made that connection in real time here, so that is interesting. However, here's the detail on our wheel fairings across the front axle. There's our double wishbone pushrod suspension going into our right front wheel in this case, and you can see the inboard side of that wheel fairing is actually somewhat reminiscent of what we have currently on the 2022 Formula One front axles there, with the listed part wheel fairing there, spec on all the cars. Interesting. However, what's not on the modern Formula One car is this fairing that's covering the rest of the front axle assembly here. Obviously integrating the headlight, the duct for brake cooling, all of this is the land of make-believe. But over top, just like you would expect to see on an LMP1, for example, you can see the gills that are venting the high-pressure air from the inside of the wheel arch. That's just to cut down on unnecessary lift. And then as we start to move inboard, you see this flying buttress strut. This is just structural. This is keeping the fairing attached to the car, basically. However, if we look at the other one, you can also see how it's serving as a winglet to produce a little bit of downforce in its own right, but mostly just to direct air into the radiator intakes right here for engine air intake as well as for radiator cooling. So that is some cool stuff right there. Additionally, across the top side, you can see we had our cockpit canopy. We have our suspension and push rod mounts there. The dampers would be underneath this bulkhead. And then coming across the top of the car, there's our shark fin structure. And then here we have got outlets for the radiator. So this is exhausting the heated air as it's gone through the radiator matrices inside the side pod. And then it's just going to vent it out here. And you can see this heat-treated bodywork going all the way down. Little bit of quanta effect going on, I would reckon, but probably not to a very large degree. Just going to be helped by the air that's coming over the top of the side pod surface and this very flat profile, it must be said, reminiscent of the F-22 fighter jet. To be entirely honest, it's very, very evocative of that in my view, and I do like that. As you can see, all of that high pressure, high speed, and hot air is going to be going underneath and down this ramp underneath the rear wing. That's really, really cool to see. Do very much like that. There's your view across the rear zone of the car. There's your roll hoop. No snorkel in it. It's just an empty hoop, but it's there and it looks cool. Very, very nice. And then underneath here, can't really see inside here too well, but there is our channel, our tunnel, that is just sucking in tons of air to blow the top side of the diffuser there. This is not where the fan's flow is predominantly coming from, but it is mixing with the engine exhaust down in there a bit, which is really, really interesting. And obviously just so much airflow available. Cockpit canopy, well, it's a cockpit canopy and lots of reflections there in it at the moment. But your cockpit is in there. You can see the backside of the display unit and the steering wheel a little bit as well, but we can get a better look at the cockpit. Looking into the cockpit here from the right rear, and first of all you can see very nice job here on the canopy by Auto Art. Looks absolutely great. Nice and crisp lines and totally transparent with very little distortion through it. Looks very cool. Also, you can see along the sides of the cockpit, Sebastian Vettel right there. Vettel did the demo lap around the Nürburgring Grand Prix circuit in the one of the forerunners to this car in the Gran Turismo 5 video game, the X2010, which was initially called the Red Bull X1, I remember. And he did a fast lap around the Grand Prix circuit at the Nürburgring, and that became a challenge in the video game in this car's forerunner. So Sebastian Vettel's name also going on X2014, quite obviously. But Yeah, so much great detail all over the place on this one. Looks really, really nice. However, if we take the gigantic 1-to-1 scale human hand and we just reach down here, yes, you can see that we can open up this canopy a bit and we can really see into the cockpit now. Have a look at this. Real cool stuff. The steering wheel is not attached to the front axle, so if I move the front wheels with my fingers, it does not turn the steering wheel. But the steering wheel is in there. Here is one of our display units. You can see just vaguely that it would be obviously some sort of liquid crystal display, semi-transparent. Really cool. You can also see along the sides here we have, they look like mirrors because they function like mirrors, but they're not mirrors, they're screens, and they are fed from cameras, which are mounted. I believe that they would be mounted to these front wheel fairings someplace along here. I don't think that there are any camera mounts modeled here, but they would be fed from camera mounts on either one of these front wheel fairings, so it would give the driver some sort of approximated view of what they would see if there were mirrors mounted roughly here. But they're just feeding these screens, and he can see what's to either side of him, behind him, at barely a glance. Additionally, though, you can see the way that the cockpit is shaped in this area. This is intaking a little bit of ambient air for cockpit cooling, so that's all nice. And then in here we have the seat. We have seat belts, which are just injection molded parts, but they are there and they look cool. And there's our canopy in its open position. There's our cockpit surround, and then the bottom of the seat. No pedal detail or anything if you really get down low, but it's really cool. I also greatly appreciate the mechanism that this canopy sits on here in the model. As you can see, it is supported on 3 articulated struts in addition to a telescoping strut. So as I close the canopy, you can see how this telescoping strut compresses in and the canopy closes. If I open it again, you can see that strut as it moves, and it's articulated in its own right. So really nice to integrate that into a model, and it's a very smooth operation. It stays open, and it opens and closes very smoothly. Very nice. Do like that a lot. Auto Art is particularly good at things like this, so I do very much appreciate having that openable detail on this model. But that's the only thing that opens on this model, it must be said. Everything else, it's just too fantastical. It's too out there. There's nothing to model in the engine bay because we don't really know what the engine on this would look like. So I'll have the cockpit, and that's cool because we do know what the cockpit more or less would look like because they had to model that for the video game. But all in all, it's just such an interesting piece. I really do like it. And finally here on X2014, the underside, and this is juicy. This is special. You can see here the front end of the car, double wishbone pushrod suspension. There's our front wing and those wheel fairings. They look relatively mundane. I mean, they don't look all that different from what you'd expect to see on the underside of a Formula One car. However, the center section, look at this. This is where the fan is intaking all of its air for that downforce generation. These 2 enormous channels on either side, they are funneling all of that air toward the fan, and it's just being sucked in, and it's just relentless. And you can even see, if we go into this angle here, you can see these circular areas. Those are the actual intake channels that are feeding directly into the fan. That's so cool. But so very, very nice that they bothered to model this part. It's so cool. The rear side of the diffuser, it's just an upturn. There's nothing special here. There are no Venturis or anything. All of that is just being taken care of by the enormous channels here that are just being actively sucked up. You'll also see this red section underneath this roughly rhomboid area. This is a skirt. And what's going on here is this area is going to make a seal with the track surface, which means that this area is going to be not in a vacuum, a true vacuum, but in a relative vacuum. We are going to suck up so much air that the pressure underneath here is going to be significantly lower than ambient atmosphere, which means lots and lots of downforce. It's remarkable. Other things that we can see underneath here, though, we have got details about the model, serial number 1317, and that is handwritten by someone at the Auto Art Factory. Auto Art trademark 118 Red Bull X2014, and then patent pending and crafted, not made, crafted in China. And of course, our assembly screws here for holding the car together. It only appears that we have these two screws here, exposed anyway in the bodywork, two screws on the front wing, and then we've got screws on the front suspension, a screw in the front of the monocoque and the nose section. Not a whole lot holding this car together fastener-wise, so it's an interesting thing, but I know everybody wants to see the under tray on the X2014, and there it is. Just enormous, utterly shameless suck effect going on, courtesy of that big old fan.
So there it was in 1/18th scale by Auto Art, the Red Bull X2014. It's a car that doesn't exist. It never has existed, and if I had to be a betting man, I would say that it never will exist. 1-to-1 scale mock-ups, yes, they have been created for certain public affairs events around the world. However, a running example of this car, what would it cost? First of all, how would you get something like this out on track? All right, the engine is not something that's particularly difficult to do. It's 1,200 horsepower. That might be fairly difficult to do out of a V6 these days. But 3-liter V6, there are a lot of road cars with 3-liter V6s, so that's not really too much of a concern. It has a semi-automatic gearbox. All right, I think it's got a 7-speed unit in the game. Maybe it would have a modern Formula One 8-speed unit, whatever. Something that is pretty tenable, something that's rather habile. It's got wishbone suspension with push rods in front. Rear suspension is a little bit ambiguous, but you could probably make that a pull rod if you wanted. Okay, very tenable. It's got this big fan in it, but all right. In the 70s, Brabham, they were able to make a fan that could do 9,000 RPM and hold together. So, okay, you could probably make a fan that could spin fast enough and hold together to create the airflow that you need for the underbody downforce. Okay, that's all tenable. Carbon bodywork, we can do that. We've been doing carbon composites for 50 years now in the aerospace industry and about 40 years in Formula One. So, okay, also tenable. So really, what is the X factor in this? Why could this not be built? Well, it's the squishy bit of skin and bone in the cockpit. Cornering forces in excess of 8G through every corner for every lap. That is going to be a little bit too much to bear for most humans. Never mind even racing drivers who are in great physical condition. Elite fighter pilots would have trouble coping with those sorts of G-forces that often for that amount of time. Yes, I know that there are videos on the internet of some of Europe's and America's greatest pilots in the centrifuge enduring 9 Gs for 30 seconds at a time, and they're absolute beasts for being able to do it, and I applaud them. I would be passing out within seconds, undoubtedly. However, to be able to maintain consciousness in that situation is one thing. To be able to maintain your coordination and the wherewithal to be aware of what's happening as you're driving a car at over 200 miles an hour in that situation while having incredible forces exerted on your body, that's something that's really asking a lot of human physiology, and I dare say it is not possible. If it is possible, it's certainly not possible to do for very long. And even at that, if you're going to be able to do a lap or maybe 2 or 3 laps at top speed around a track with a car like this, it's going to be an absolutely titanic effort from even some of the most capable physically and otherwise drivers in the world. So that's really the X factor to getting this car built. It could be built. The technology makes sense. Everything required to put this car together absolutely exists and absolutely is already in use either in the automotive industry or otherwise in aerospace, in particular the underbody fan components. It has more in common with a jet engine than it does with anything in the automotive world. But to build that car, to put out all of that expense in money and development and resource and just time to build the thing, to build that car for it not to be able to be driven in anger at top speed by 99% of humanity doesn't seem like a very good return on investment to me. The Red Bull X2014 and the other cars in the Red Bull X series, such as the X2010 before this one, I think will most likely remain subjects of video games in the virtual reality world. However, they are very intriguing design studies and very intriguing thought experiments when we consider the possibilities and consider the question of just what is actually possible. If we really wanted to do something amazing, could we perhaps make something like the Red Bull X2014? Until next time, I do thank you all very, very much for watching. Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you very much. And of course, we will see you soon.